Thank you for coming tonight. My name is Ian Andrews. I'm the Executive Director at Lakewood Alive. We are Lakewood's nonprofit community development organization. Our mission is to foster and sustain vibrant neighborhoods. And there is, it's very important that we have vibrant neighborhoods when we can communicate with one another and when we can listen. And we are of all different backgrounds and different opinions and different minds. But I think it's really important that we think about the environment which we all live in, not just locally, but also nationally, and how we're all inundated in certain mediums by things that are happening around the world and here at home. And so we want to have a discussion tonight about civility and mutual respect and how we can disagree with one another, but to do so maybe in different ways. And so we have a really great panel tonight. A couple points of order. I'd like to remind you that we are videotaping. Michael back there always does a really nice job for us. So this will be eventually put on the Lakewood Alive website. You can go to lakewoodalive.org and check it out. Also, thank you to the library for hosting us. They're a phenomenal host, and we appreciate them having us. And thank you to our Community Forum Committee, chaired by Cindy Einhaus. We have several board members and non-board members who help us out. If the committee members wouldn't mind just raising their hand, we appreciate the time that you put into this. So thank you very much. We're a small staff of 5 3/4 people in the basement down there below Panera. Hopefully you get out of there one of these days. So we're volunteer-led, and so by having really dedicated volunteers, that's how we're able to pull so many things together. And then the last piece, if you have a question, you should have gotten a little note card and a golf pencil. Because of the limited amount of time and the number of questions we may have, we ask you to please just write your question down on a note card. The committee members will have to gather them, and then we'll get them to the moderator, and then we'll be able to get them to the panelists. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce our moderator, Judge Michael J. Ryan, the Juvenile Division of Cuyahoga County Court of Common Pleas. A lot of C's in there. In November 2005, the citizens of the city of Cleveland and the village of Bracknell elected Michael John Ryan as a judge for the Cleveland Municipal Court for a 6-year term, making him the youngest African-American male to be elected judge in the history of the court at age 34. He was re-elected without opposition in 2011. In November of 2012, he was elected judge to the Cuyahoga County Court of Common Pleas Juvenile Division as only the second African-American male, but the youngest at 41. In November of 2016, he was elected without opposition to a full 6-year term as judge for the Juvenile Division. And he holds the distinction as being the only African-American juvenile court judge in the entire state of Ohio. It gives me very great pleasure to introduce Judge Ryan.
Good evening, Lakewood. Say that again. Good evening, Lakewood.
Hello!
I was going to ask that everyone please rise. So I thought twice about that. Again, I am Judge Michael Ryan. I'm honored and humbled to have been selected as the moderator for this Lakewood Alive sponsored event. Thank you, Ian, for that awesome introduction. I hope I live up to it this evening. I want to thank the Lakewood Library again for being gracious hosts, and thank all of you for coming out and hopefully being active participants in the topic of discussion tonight, which is civil discourse and mutual respect. Now, this is my second experience, or strike the second time moderating an event. So if I miserably fail, I can't attribute it to inexperience no longer. Instead, I'll chalk it up to exhaustion. And I say that because as Judge Williams Byers told me today as she was walking in, she said, "You ought to be flat on your face." And the reason is because I finished an 11-hour marathon hearing at 2 o'clock this morning. Oh. That started at 1 o'clock, 2 o'clock, so actually it was 12 hours, 2 o'clock yesterday afternoon. It was an important case. It was a case regarding determining whether or not permanent custody should be given to the Division of Family Services. So there were 2 children involved, parents, grandparents, foster parents, social workers, and I think they had everyone in the city of Cleveland testify. And so that made the program much longer. I mean, the trial much longer. And so I am running on fumes. tonight, but I will do my level best to ensure that this particular program goes off without a hitch. We have some dynamic members of the community who have eagerly and graciously agreed to participate as panelists. They're going to introduce themselves in a short time and address some predetermined questions as well. And of course, as Ian has already advised you, we're going to ask that the audience participate with questions from themselves. And then lastly, we're going to try to summarize everything that we've learned and things that hopefully we can take away from this discussion. Now, there are two people that you should never give a mic to, at least that's what I've been told. One is a preacher and the other one is an attorney. And by trade, obviously, I am an attorney. But today I'm going to give the mic up to these three individuals for the majority of the time of this discussion. But you ought to be careful because Judge Byers is both an attorney and preacher. So the two other panelists, you may never get the mic back.
So I sat in the middle.
That's what I said. Now, I'll just say a little bit about what this discussion means to me, and don't be frightened by what I do in a few seconds. But I'll start it this way. You lie. The latter two are examples of an erosion of the respect for the highest elected office in the world, as well as the form where it occurred. You lie was a statement hurled by a congressman at President Obama during the State of the Union address. The second was a reenactment of President George Bush dodging the shoe that was thrown at him during a press conference in Iraq. There are more similar and unfortunately more severe acts which cause it to question whether civility, especially in public discourse, still exists. Incivility is defined as rude or unsociable speech or behavior, discourteousness, impolite or offensive comments or offensive actions. Unfortunately, we're here this evening because we've witnessed people and institutions be less inclined to suppress hostile reactions in exchange for calm, logical debate. Tonight we're going to explore questions revolving around why civil discourse and mutual respect have deteriorated. What are the consequences individuals could incur who engage in unreasonable and civil discourse? What tools can we use when we are confronted with civil discourse that morphs into incivility, to prevent harm, and or redirect the conversation to something more constructive? In my and Judge Gail Williams-Byers' profession, the central function is for us to resolve conflicts, which means that individuals will be confrontational. Accordingly, judges have a power that other people don't, and that is the power of contempt. And it means that we can immediately impose punitive measures when an individual is behaving uncivilly, because said conduct can be deemed as interfering with the administration of justice. While contempt is a way of corralling uncivilized conduct, there are other consequences for similar acts that occur outside of the court that could result in an individual's appearance before a judge. A person who engages in menacing, causes someone to believe that you will cause harm to them, puts the alleged offender's liberty at risk for 30 days. A person who uses force and attempts to cause or causes physical harm is subject to prosecution. Individuals could also find themselves subject to restraining orders for the latter conduct when the victim is fearful that the person may attempt to harm them. A person who suffers an injury could acquire monetary damages from the culpable party, assault and battery, could lead, and as well as intentional infliction of emotional distress. There are other collateral consequences like diminished reputation amongst family, friends, and neighbors. So those are some of the things that we're going to discuss tonight. I am moderator and referee, so that means if they go over their time limit, there could be some sanctions involved.
I picked up on that message. I've been watching Judge Judy all week. And how you can sit between two judges and get along. I'm ready. Thank you, Judge Judy. My name is Ed Smith, and me and my wife and I have been long-term residents of the Cleveland area. She from Lakewood, me from Rocky River, and now Wilton Bay Village. And 2/3 of our offspring live here too, which we appreciate. It's a great place to be. But over the last 50 years, I've seen a lot of the world, and I've seen a lot that most people don't see. My first 30 years were dealing with two oil industries, two oil companies, Union Oil Company of California and then BP, working not so far from home, other than if you count Alaska as being a long ways away from home. But I've seen the path going away from just typical engineering through design and construction into actually handling relationships with people. And that came to a head in Alaska, where I was spending a lot of time dealing with the Alaskan natives and their interaction with British Petroleum and other members of the oil industry. And from that point, I actually started working internationally. I started out working for an ultra-rich Dutchman who I should have done my background check on because he went to jail later on for laundering Russian money. But he introduced me to doing work in the former Soviet Union right after it broke up. And this is when the Russian central government was still trying to figure out how to get along with the regional government. Countries like Kazakhstan and Turkmenistan were still trying to figure out what they could get away with, and their locals, KGB heads were taking over as presidents, or their Communist Party heads were taking over as presidents. So there was a lot of motion going on at that time, which led to a lot of disputes and some dispute resolution that occasionally worked. So I got a lot of experience in that area. But I went on from there to various other jobs, actually dealing with the Taliban for a while when Unocal was trying to have 2 pipelines built through Afghanistan, and this was back when the Taliban were viewed as a stabilizing force in Afghanistan, not a destabilizing force. But I went on from that point to work on the development of energy projects throughout the world, most of it focused in Central Asia, where they were still evolving politically. There was a lot of money flowing back and forth, a lot of people that shouldn't have been in office were in office. But it was a very good experience. I got to work very closely with not only the heads of state, presidents, but also the people in the field who were just scraping by day to day. To try to mediate between those two is a challenge and very important. My wife and I were in Afghanistan for almost 2 years, working for the State Department, and while I was there, I was responsible for trying to regenerate a country, meaning helping with regenerating a system of laws, banking system, water management, health system, and also managing what happens at the border, which would be counterinsurgency, etc. There's a lot that came from that. I think it was a tremendous life-changing experience for both of us. We went on from there to eventually work in Saudi Arabia and Bahrain, running the business there for an Australian company, and now I've gone on to work in individual assignments in Pakistan, Guyana, South Sudan prior to the current conflict going on, and looking forward to some more adventures. So lots of opportunity for disputes and dispute resolution. Thank you.
Thank you.
I wish I had a resume as deep as my colleagues here. But I want to begin by saying to you Lakewood residents, thank you all so much for the invitation of being here this evening, and more than that, for the courage of starting an important conversation. When I was invited to be here, I immediately reflected on my experience, not just as a municipal judge, which I suppose each of you could bet, just as with Judge Ryan, I see, deal with, handle, and sometimes find myself in the middle of disputes and resolving them on a near daily basis. If not in court, as a mother and a wife, that is also my experience on a fairly regular basis. But I didn't begin as a judge. I started my career as one of your assistant Cuyahoga County prosecutors. And in my near decade experience in that role, it was almost regular, daily dispute resolution between our office and the position of the office in handling certain cases, frequently not pleasant, and the attorneys or the parties that often end up on the other side. Sometimes those disputes were with our own victims, our own witnesses, and trying to encourage them to understand that in their roles as victims, they represent a broader, a greater community, which deserves to be protected, and that their experience in this particular offense merely represents a lack of civility that as a society we've all deemed unacceptable. And so the prosecution of a particular case is not so much personal as it is an effort to, again, maintain the civil dictates of a society as we have determined them to be. As a judge, one can imagine that I encounter folks every day who walk into my court with high levels of anxiety, are not very clear as to what their outcomes are or what they can expect, perhaps operate from certain expectations, and sometimes they're very low expectations. Many people don't even expect to be referred to as sir or ma'am or Ms. or Mrs., but to experience some form of demoralization. And so that anxiety frequently comes with them. And from that is the experience of the exchange, which is not always pleasant. And sometimes it's just downright disrespectful. Indeed, as Judge Ryan said, the ability of a judge is to maintain decorum in the courtroom, and we've got a lot of tools to do that. But in all the years I've been on the bench, I can proudly say I've never had to use my gavel to maintain decorum in my courtroom. What I've learned is that the very tenor and tone of my voice can do that all by itself. And so when properly measured, you can get anybody to pay attention to you when properly measured. And so I'm excited to have a conversation, not just about what incivility is, but even to broaden it more, to talk more so about what some of the root causes are, how we get there, and how we show empathy and compassion to individuals who are not expecting it, but also how we can turn that behavior by our very responses. And sometimes that's just the thing that's needed. Whether you wear a robe on a bench or whether you wear a bathrobe in your house, those things can really, really matter. And so to you, Lakewood residents and friends of Lakewood, as I feel like I am a Lakewood resident, my kid goes to, it was VinCAD and is now the North Coast College, so I feel like I am one of your neighbors as well. At least all my tuition dollars come here. But I am really excited to have this conversation. I am grateful that you all are forward-thinking enough to begin it, and I am excited for where it will take us. Thank you.
Wow, two great perspectives to follow. My name is Ty Olson. I work here in Cleveland at Tri-C. I manage our conflict resolution and peace studies program, as well as some other programs at the college. And as a community college, we also do work in the community, so some of the programs I work with are community focused. I'm not from the Cleveland area. I came to Ohio for the first time 6 years ago. I grew up in the Pacific Northwest, and a lot of people are like, oh, Washington, Oregon, liberal states. Well, I grew up in rural Washington and Oregon in farming towns. My dad was a dairy farmer and my mom was a substitute teacher. So I grew up in very conservative America. And I went to college at a small Quaker university outside of Portland, which really shifted the way that I saw the world and understood human relationships. And that opportunity caused me to think about, how we have different values and beliefs and experiences and backgrounds and different color skin and different identities, but really a lot of what we want and need is the same. After college, I lived abroad in Honduras, Central America, which at the time was the most dangerous place to live in the Americas for 2 years. And that shifted my worldview a little bit more. Then I moved back to Portland, one of the most liberal cities in the United States, after being raised in conservative America, and that shifted my view some more. So I see all of those early parts of my life forced me to see things from different perspectives, and naturally I ended up in a field, conflict resolution, where it is about trying to bring people together to see things from the other person's perspective. So that's where I come from a little bit. I have been in Cleveland area for 6 years now, working at Tri-C, and it's been a really wonderful opportunity. I love the Cleveland area. I love the different cities and neighborhoods and parts of Northeast Ohio. I'm a Cleveland Heights person myself, but I think it's really important that these types of conversations, these dialogues are taking place here in Lakewood, as well as in other suburb cities, as well as in Cleveland proper. So I feel honored and excited to be a part of this conversation tonight. So I'm excited to see what we talk about, and I'm excited to listen and learn as well. So.
I began with a dictionary definition of what incivility is, but I'm going to ask the panelists to define civility and incivility, and talk about the differences between incivility and bullying, and also consequences of extreme situations, and not just extreme situations, but everyday, more subtle incivility.
I think
That's a mouthful.
it's a mouthful, but we'll give it a try. I think one of the big differences you mentioned was bullying versus incivility. Bullying is when you go after somebody to damage that person, either psychologically, physically, or in some other way. The incivility, I think, is when you're going after someone generally orally to try to get them to change their mind or to believe what you're believing. Civility is when you're able to talk to someone by looking at them, talking in a quiet tone, as you mentioned, or an appropriate tone at that time, and trying to understand where they're coming from. I think that's one of the key things. I've looked up the judge's background, and his background is so different from mine. I have to say, when I'm going to talk to the judge and do it in a civil manner, I have to start thinking about how he might interpret what I'm saying. He comes geographically from a socioeconomic background, tremendously different. My background, as I mentioned, has been heavily saturated with overseas assignments. And you have to think about how culturally people think in other parts of the world, how they talk in other parts of the world, how they negotiate in other parts of the world. And unfortunately, that's something that we're not seeing in our current political environment. So we've got a lot to learn. The diversity is so much that you have to stop and think about. That when you're talking about a subject that is a hot subject, you have to stop and think about how every word you're saying is going to be interpreted or misinterpreted. Be very careful.
And so I'm happy to take the second part of that question, because I think you've done an awesome job of making the distinctions between what we can appreciate as civility and civility versus bullying. But I think the judge asked for maybe specific examples of bullying, either overt or covert. And so I'll share with you an experience that I had several years ago as a jurist, and it was one of the earlier cases that I never expected would sort of snowball into something that made the evening news and every other newspaper. But I guess that's probably an experience that you have too, Judge Ryan. You never know when it's going to be that case. But so the Cliff Notes version is that for many, many years, these neighbors shared just sort of a common space between their homes. There were clear lines of demarcation, so it was very clear whose property was whose. But from the day the one neighbor moved in, being the younger of the two neighbors by years, for whatever reason, she could just never seem to earn the favor of her pre-existing neighbor. The neighbors seemed to always have some issue or challenge, either with this particular woman or her husband or her children, either biological or adopted. And in this instance, the neighbors that had just moved in, they were a non-minority couple who graciously adopted two severely, mentally and physically severely disabled minority children, African-American children. And one was in a wheelchair, and was unable to walk. Another was barely able to walk on their own, but did to some limited degree. And so for many years, the one neighbor experienced probably what you would define as bullying. Everything from having, bleach and fabric softener poured all over flowers to kill them off, being sued for using the wrong brand of mulch on the yard because according to the pre-existing neighbor, it made him sick. And so one fateful day, the existing neighbor had it, and having an engineering background, he took a dryer that you use to dry your clothes, and he ran ducts from it out of his garage, which he cut a hole into the garage to vent the ductwork out of the dryer. And he filled the dryer with kerosene and turned it on and vented the kerosene toward the neighbor's home who had the minority children, the disabled children. And by the way, whose husband was suffering with severe dementia. And so she was the primary caregiver for her husband and her disabled children. And although she had an adult child that lived in the home, the adult child had gone to work that day. And so on this day, that neighbor really had to make a life or death decision. She believed her home was leaking gas and that at any moment it might actually blow up. She was too afraid to use this cordless phone in her home, believing it might spark the gas and level her home. Her husband has severe dementia, so she didn't want to leave him behind. One of her children is in a wheelchair and can't walk, and the other uses braces to walk. And so the idea that she would be the only one surviving was something she couldn't live with. So she didn't want to leave the house. She was literally paralyzed with fear. So she ultimately gained the courage to go outside, use the phone, call the fire department, and they came over, and lo and behold, after some investigating, they found out where the smell came from. And this neighbor was unrepentant in his behavior. He was unrepentant in how he had treated her. He referred to her as a, quote, monkey mama, and other purely derogatory statements. And there was no way that this neighbor, or seemingly anyone at that point, could rationalize with this individual for why they were so visceral. So I think that probably embodies uncivilized behavior. Dangerous as well, because I'll also note the child that was in the wheelchair was actually rushed to a Ahuja that night for treatment because of inhalation. And ultimately, I recall there being an exchange between myself and the attorney for the defendant, just trying to understand and appreciate how do you get to that point? What must have happened in your experiences that brought you to that point? And there was nothing that I could really rationalize except a feeling of complete ownership of his environment. How dare anyone tell him what he can do and can't do? And if the neighbors didn't like it, they could move. And so it didn't work out so well for that defendant. But I do believe that I gained a bit of insight. And so luckily, as part of his sentence, and I'm a huge proponent of creative sentencing, part of it was that he would undergo diversity training in order to better prepare him and to give him tools, because his neighbor wasn't moving anywhere. She couldn't give her house away.
Was the diversity training while he was in jail?
Well, I think I did one better, because as opposed to incarceration, which I think in that instance would have protected him and precluded him from the experiences of an entire community that no doubt had a response to this, I had him sit on a street corner for about 9 hours with a sign that outlined what he did and how he treated them and how he needed to experience the response of his neighbors and his community, none of whom actually shared those same feelings and emotions. And so in those instances, I just didn't believe that incarceration was a proper response, because if you're incarcerated, you're inoculated, in a sense, from the community that you share with others, which is in fact as diverse as this family that lives next to you. I also required that he do his community service in the outweight area so that he could have a little bit more exposure, if you will, to communities of color and diverse communities, again, so as to elevate his appreciation. And that, I think, is an example, a clear example of just outright over uncivilized behavior that perhaps has some root cause issues that are born out of childhood or adult experiences, but had clearly not been redirected, because this had to have been probably the 6th or 7th time he had been in that same court with same or similar offenses with the same or similar victim, but whose outcomes were very different before. So he got a wake-up call. Over.
Mr. Olson?
Yeah, sure. Thank you both. I'm just gonna speak to civility for a second. So oftentimes incivility is tied to like identity and values and beliefs. And so, as well as civility, when we're civil towards one another, it's communicating in a way that still respects the different beliefs, identities, values of people, even though they might be completely different or even in opposition to our own, still listening to them respectfully, giving them an opportunity to voice their perspective, to share about their experience. And so when I think about civility, it's being able to, it's communicating in a way, even though you might have different beliefs, values, identities, but still communicating in a way that is respectful and dignified, and doesn't tear down the other person or individual. So.
And can I also add, I think that that's an excellent definition, but I think what also helps is acknowledging those differences in the conversation. That reminds the listener that although you may not agree, their position and their opinion matters enough for you to absorb it in the process of the exchange. There's no requirement to adopt the position, but it is the mere acknowledgement that it exists that helps to move the conversation along in a manner that is more civilized or more respectful in tone and demeanor.
Yeah, and can I add one more thing to that? Right along with what the judge was sharing, there's this excellent quote by a former Assistant Secretary of General, Harold Sanders, who talks about communicating in a dialogical way and how we can listen so deeply that we seek to understand and be changed by what we hear without giving up our own identity. But that also means recognizing those differences in our identity and values as well. So, yeah, so that's excellent.
I think one of the ways we can improve civility in our discussions is actually to look for commonality rather than focusing on the differences. When you're talking about a subject where you may have differences. One of my experiences was working in Guyana, where the population is split between descendants of slaves from Africa and descendants of indentured Indians from India. And they are two very opposing factions, and the government goes back and forth. My job down there was to try to find a way to take the prospective wealth from offshore oil that was being developed and use it in a way that would help both both factions, insulate the use from possibly going into deep pockets and provide benefits to both populations. And it was focusing on, what do we want? We want jobs, we want sustainability, we want to make sure there's equal opportunity for people. How do we do that? Let's set up a sovereign wealth fund that will manage the investments or the generation of cash over time and be monitored by a third-party group from outside the country. When we're looking at jobs, how about if we take something like the mining of bauxite, instead of shipping that overseas, let's start up some base industries right here in the country that'll provide jobs. So I think finding commonality is quite often a very good first step. Yes, we both believe in having security at our home. We might not agree on the best way to do it, but let's talk about how we define security at home, or whatever the issue might be that you're talking about. Look for a common objective, and then try to overcome the things that might be differences between parties.
I'm going to ask that you limit your responses to the next questions. We're actually on a pretty strict schedule because I believe we have to be out by 8:30. And we are fast approaching the time where we're supposed to cut off questions. And we've only got through 2 questions. Actually, only one, really. But some of your responses have actually addressed some of the other questions. And so I'm going to skip around here and ask, what are the causes of incivility and divisive communication? You know, why might someone be motivated to engage in uncivil discourse? Judge, you can start first.
Thank you, and I am going to adhere to that, even though, and I forgot to say this, I am not a preacher. I think Judge Ryan just tried to throw me under the bus.
Yeah, so I just assumed that she would
So
be
I
too.
feel a bit of a track on my back. But so, insofar as I feel like I deal with folks who are high anxiety every day. What I can say is I can probably tick off a couple things that I think are telltale signs of the undercurrents for incivility. Perhaps chief among them is anxiety. Anxiety born out of lack of knowledge or lack of appreciation for the process or not knowing what to expect. And so a lot of the responses that I get, I believe, from people are not personal. And so I've had to become a bit of an armadillo. I don't take it personally. I realize that it's coming from a place of anxiety or ignorance, which is not to besmirch them, but it is to just identify that many are just not very familiar with the process. And what you don't know can often scare you. And if you don't feel like your experience is respected enough that someone will take the time and explain something to you, even if it requires explaining more than once, then that level of anxiety raises, it automatically increases. I like to tell people, I realize when they walk in my courtroom that the room feels big and ominous. All of a sudden it feels like the voices boom and there's an echo. There's someone sitting in a dark black robe at the front of the room that's elevated higher than they are, seemingly looking down on them, prepared to pass judgment on them, and they've got no idea if they're gonna walk out that door and meet their kid at the bus stop in order to take them home, or if something else is going to happen and their life is gonna be turned upside down. That is an enormous amount of stress and pressure that some people actually walk into the room with. And understanding and appreciating that anxiety from the position of the power player, if you will, I believe can go a long way in what I call lowering the temperature in the room, because the temperature is high when that anxiety is brought in with the participants. Aside from anxiety, I think also that it is a matter of some individuals not genuinely knowing how better to conduct themselves. Perhaps in their own experiences, this is all they've ever seen or heard or known. And so what they are in fact doing is mimicking behavior that they have seen practiced or rehearsed in environments they're comfortable in. And so once they leave those environments and join us in other parts of society, they are doing no more than what they have been shown to do, because in their minds there is no other way to achieve the goal that they might believe they want to achieve. See, I've never known anybody to give in because they've been called a litany of curse words. I just don't know that person. I've never known anyone to say, yeah, you win, you got it, I'm gonna see it your way, because they've been yelled and screamed at. That's never happened. It's usually just a battle of the highest pitched voices, and no one ever really understands or even hears the other person. So somebody's gotta bring the temperature down. The last thing I'd say is that frequently these are attributable to sometimes persistent and severe mental illnesses. Sometimes individuals present with challenges, deep diagnosable challenges, that are in fact the undercurrents for why they are reacting or responding the way that they are, which is not always what we expect on the receiving end, but it is the reality of the person we're dealing with. And so hopefully if we get another question, I'll talk a bit about techniques that I use when dealing with individuals that come in from any one of those avenues, because I believe developing tools and techniques is important to ensuring that A, you leave the conversation safely, that something has been achieved from the conversation, be it a mutual viewpoint or an agreement on a commonality, or even that you understand that you're gonna, as my mother would always say, agree to disagree. Sometimes you have to agree to disagree.
Mr. Olson, can you address the issue of how social media has helped or hurt civil discourse?
Yeah, I think that when people are face to face and they disagree, it's a lot different than when there is like this wall between them. And social media, it's easier to just react without seeing the other person's response or getting the other person's perspective. It's when we're communicating directly with another human being, I think it, in my experience, people are a little bit kinder when they can see how our words impact the other. Now, that's not always the case. Judge brought up some really good points with anxiety, mental illness, with poor modeling of how to engage with people when you're afraid. But I think that also, I mean, to the point that the judge made about what people have seen, like what we see, what we are, a lot of the attention that is given to social media is about people being angry and yelling with their written words online. So that's what people see and is being modeled to them. We don't hear reports about the way people are kind on social media nearly as often as we hear about them hating on one another, right? Yeah, I think those are just a few initial thoughts that come to mind when we think of social media.
Ed, I know because of your vast background in dealing with dispute resolution, can you talk about some of the choices that we have when we are encountering uncivil behavior, and maybe some tools or strategies that you use in your previous experiences to address those types of problems?
A good, quiet approach is a good thing to do. If you see groups that are arguing, separate them and try to find out what the dispute is. Quite often in meetings where there is conflict, I have the benefit of being able to sit in the back for a while and see who the key players are and what their soft parts or their tender points are, and you can step in and you can actually throw in a couple of words that will help change the direction that the discussion is going. But you have to step back as an impartial observer and be able to do that. It helps also to know the rank of the people in that meeting, that you might have to protect a second in command from his senior person if they've got differing positions. So you can go in there as the foil or as a shield, backing up or trying to introduce your idea as a subordinate's idea and changing the way things are going. So you can be an instrument, a sacrificial instrument in some ways, to changing the way discussion is going. So there's all kinds of ways. It's really, I think, reading your audience, seeing the way they react. I know the judge talked about a quiet approach, using the tone at the right time. One of the things I've noticed is when you start talking to people and they don't like what you're saying, their eyes start rolling, their hands come up like this, you can read their body language and say, guys, let's keep our hands on our laps and listen politely to what's being said. Let's try to understand what's being said. If you don't understand it, let's ask a question. Burrow down. Don't use provocative adverbs and adjectives to get things going. If you're using pronouns, you say like, oh, they say all the time that this is going to collapse. You say, who's the they? And are they saying it all the time? If there's a subject you don't understand, burrow down a little bit. Or if they come out with a fact that you don't think is a fact, don't attack them. Just say, I hadn't heard that before. Where'd you hear that? and just try to get them to defend what they're saying, but not doing it in a way that you're actually defending, and more explaining and building support. So I think listening to your audience, trying to get them to collaborate a little bit more, find out where their stories are coming from. I see some snickering going on out there. I was reminded by my son when I started off that one of my sayings was, read my lips. Trying to help them through their growing up years. That's not what you use when you've got a debate going on.
Yeah.
We are actually over time, but.
You're good, keep on going.
We're good?
Got a little bit more, go ahead.
Okay. I was going to ask you how to do their closing.
No,
but,
go, let's go.
keep going, okay, great. Well, Judge, you had talked about some of the tools that you use, or that you wanted to discuss. Why don't you take this opportunity to do that now?
And so to piggyback off of just what was said, I think what we're essentially agreeing to is that one of the best, perhaps, first steps is to work to engage a conversation, not a confrontation. And that is achieved by active listening. And active listening is best achieved by being able to tell someone what they just said to you. Again, it's not an edict that you adopt as your own what their position is, but what it does is immediately reminds the other person that you are actually listening to them. And even though you may not agree with what they're saying, they are now reassured that you hear them. Now, you may have a very different point of view as to how to achieve a common goal. More often than not, though, in these engagements, your goals are probably fairly common. That's more likely than not why the conversation is being engaged. You want to reach an outcome that is common to both of you. What I like to do when I see someone tending to exhibit their frustration, their anger, their discontent, their anxiety has heightened, and let's just face it, these things have a way of being contagious. You know, if you're engaged in a conversation with someone and they are flinging curse words or they're being unkind, or you feel like they're now using body language that is very offensive, they're pointing or they're turning their back to you or they're huffing while you're speaking, and so everything you can imagine that would seem to be uncivilized or even disrespectful or negative is happening. I like to employ a method that I call the stop method. And so the stop method is simply to stop, take a breath, observe, and then proceed. What it does in that period of time is it forces all of the energy to sort of settle down. No one's ever gonna argue with themselves. And if that person is arguing with themselves, that's your cue to exit stage right. But if they are not, and this is actually an engaged conversation, then what you've immediately done is you've sent the signal that they do not have a partner in the fight. They have an active listener, but they don't have a partner in the fight. And again, it is another one of those obvious tools to turn down the temperature of what seems to be a heightening or a discussion that could be heated. And so I would encourage you, I'd say start at home, because I started this method with my husband. And then I took it to the bench. It works in both places, folks.
Yeah.
But to stop, take a breath, observe, and then proceed. And you can time that in any way you want. There is no time limit on how long you stop, how long your inhalation is. That is a cleansing inhalation to say, hey, look, I'm trying to get the negativity out. To observe, and I don't mean to stare someone down to make them uncomfortable, but to take in the surroundings and maybe even gather your thoughts. And then proceed, because frequently what happens in uncivilized discourse is people are speaking before they're thinking. And so whatever is coming up is coming out, and at the end of the day, there are a lot of apologies that are surrendered when if only someone had taken a moment to think about it before they said anything, they might have been able to sidestep a lot of the outcomes.
Wonderful. I'm going to ask at this time, actually I'm going to order at this time, for individuals who have questions to raise their hand.
Or if you need a note card and a little pencil, if you want to write down your questions, then
Or
you can.
maybe I should order you to have a question. We have several here. Because as you, hopefully you recall, when we started the program, we asked that this be an interactive event. And so we want you to participate. You may have that burning question that you think is inappropriate, or you think is stupid, because no question is stupid, but may not think that is something that will be beneficial. Please ask the question. I'm going to ask that Ed answer this question. When there is trauma in the victim, you're going to have to help me. How do you wrote this question?
I wrote it.
Oh, okay. Okay, now I see. How do you handle the back and forth? The talk that triggers a fight or flight, instinctive and then as a lawyer, reaction of the victim in court. I have the judge can answer the second part, but I'm going to ask that Ed answer the first one. Again, the question is, where there is trauma in the victim, how do you handle the back and forth talk that triggers the flight or fight instinct or instinct?
You're talking about someone that's been shot or knifed?
It could be, or people know that have a traumatic history, and they're gonna fight to survive by fight or flight in the middle of something serious.
I always run like heck. But, you know, I go back to trying to calm things down, to try to focus, one, if there is someone that is suffering from trauma, how can we prevent that person from seeing any deterioration in their life at that point? If you've got someone who's intent on stabbing them more, obviously you're going to try to get that individual away. I've never been in that situation. I've been in situations where it could have been like that very, very quickly. That's a good question. I can't answer it. I'm going to let you take care of the legal part.
Well, I want to share, I understand what you're saying, and one thing that I have the pleasure and the honor of doing is I now teach judges all over the country on different subject matters, and one that's particularly close to my heart is the topic of vicarious trauma and what we call compassion fatigue, because the victims and the parties in the court aren't the only ones who experience the trauma. Imagine being the jurist that hears it over and over and over again, or sees the pictures over and over and over again. That just as part of the human experience, it's hard to not absorb that. But so I'll share this really quickly with you. Everybody responds differently to trauma. And it's important that those who are dealing with people with trauma understand both the physical and some of the emotional cues that are given when someone's heightened because of a traumatic experience. When I was a prosecutor, I remember having this one case where it was a domestic violence, and it was a pretty serious domestic violence, and the victim was on the witness stand. And one of the techniques that defense attorneys use is when they're questioning a victim, they like to stand right in front of the victim and ask them the question to sort of focus their attention to the defense attorney as opposed to the jury. In this particular instance, we'll call the defendant Larry. And so Larry's sitting on the opposite side of the room at the table. And while the defense attorney is trying really hard to focus the witness and to say, hey, this never happened to you, you don't know what's going on. And before I could stand up and object to the treatment of the victim would swerve her chair around the defense attorney and point at the defendant and tell him, you know what you did to me, you know you hit me, and this was going on and on throughout the entire exchange, because you had a victim who wasn't particularly interested in fleeing, but was particularly, and now she felt powerful. She could fight in the courtroom because she was well protected in that environment and maybe didn't feel that elsewhere. As a prosecutor, I would have known, I didn't know how to deal with that. As a judge, I feel like I'm more skilled now, that I could probably handle that situation a lot better by giving the victim as the witness some instructions to help to calm that concern while still getting her point across. Others don't respond so well, and again, it's important to know that. But when you acknowledge that, and when you talk to them, and they acknowledge that that's what they're experiencing, you don't have to adopt it, or again, they're in position, but they want you to know that they want you to know that they had that experience, and that you are empathetic to what they've been going through. And I think that goes a long way to ensuring that you don't have the all-out war, physical war in a courtroom setting.
Great. We're going to segue here, and I want to ask Ty this particular question. Can you talk about empathy and its difference from sympathy in maintaining civility? And which one do you prefer, empathy or sympathy?
This is a great question. This is really important in civility from my perspective. So I often like connecting sympathy to this idea that I feel your pain or whatever, but empathy is trying to understand yourself in another person's shoes. How many of you here are familiar with the golden rule, right? Treat others the way they want to be treated, or some variation of that, right? I like talking about in conflict, the question is, do we always want to be treated the same way that other person does, or in any tense situation? I have a good friend, his name is Quee. He likes to bake cakes and make things for people, and one year for my birthday, he was like, hey Ty, I'm gonna make you a cake for your birthday. If Quee were to make a cake based on how he would like to be treated, Quee would make an ice cream cake. He loves ice cream cakes. Guess what? I'm lactose intolerant. I don't want an ice cream cake. So if he were to treat me the way he wanted to be treated, following the golden rule, that's not the way I want to be treated. I want a German chocolate cake with just sugar frosting, okay? The less milk, the better. So empathy is treating others the way they want to be treated, or I would even take it a step further, is being with others the way they want you to be with them. And what is tricky about that is we make assumptions based on our biases, based on our stereotypes of people all the time that are so off point. And that's oftentimes, I think, when people think of empathy, it's like, well, that person's, of this religion and that color skin, and they grew up in that neighborhood, so I'm going to try and imagine myself in their shoes. Well, if we try and do that only based on our perceptions of where they're from and what they look like, we're going to be off base 90% of the time. Empathy is about getting to know people, asking them open-ended questions, listening to them deeply, like the judge was talking about earlier. And once we can do that, especially when we have different perspectives and opinions, then we learn how to be in relationship with them in a way that's more constructive. So those are my thoughts on empathy and sympathy. Empathy all the way, but active empathy, not passive empathy. Don't act on your assumptions and biases and stereotypes about people. Get to know them.
Ty, can you comment at all on the evolution of empathy?
How so? What do you mean?
Empathy that I learned when I was, years ago, looked like Ty and my hair was darker, is different from young people's sense of empathy now. I think empathy back then extended to a much broader community. Today, that community is less, and if you see somebody being mugged on the street, today I think there's more of a tendency to walk on by than there probably was 50 years ago. I just think it's eroded a bit over time. Empathy is a great thing. We don't see enough of it today, and I think we need a way to bring it back.
Yeah, I think you're accurate about that, and I see it played out in court quite often, where I have an individual who is a young person that commits, a pretty heinous offense, and there's no remorse, There's no empathy, even when I suggested, well, put yourself in that individual's shoes. What if that was your mother, or that was your father, who's the victim of that particular incident? And there's a blank stare across their face, as opposed to if I were to tell someone who was my age, or someone who's a little bit more experienced, they would have a different understanding, and there'll be a different result in terms of their facial features, maybe even tears that would result from me making that particular statement. But you don't necessarily see that a lot with the young people. And I know there has been, I think, unfortunately, a dilution here where kids don't empathize for other individuals. I think there was an example, this is something I was reading, where they were discussing a situation where there was someone who was a part of the white nationalists, and this individual was a victim, a victim of one of the white nationalists. The white nationalist was abusing his wife. And so someone was commenting about, how could this young lady remain in a relationship with someone that she knows is prejudiced and biased against other individuals, and not looking at the fact that she had been abused by this individual for years, physically abused. He just completely dismissed and ignored the fact that she was a victim of violence and showed no empathy for her. And they're saying that is what is unfortunately, the status quo of some of the young people, and that they don't think like we do. And there's got to be something that is causing that we need to address in order for empathy to be re-engaged with these young people. I have other questions. Actually, I think we may have dealt with this one, but how does one deal with a neighbor who refuses to act in a logical, never-ending manner necessary to bring about a resolution to a problem? I think the judge did address that with her case, but are there other resources available in the community where this neighbor could have gone short or prior to this heinous act occurring?
The short answer is yes, and I think in my community as well as in many others, there are dispute resolution resources and opportunities to handle matters outside of the traditional justice process. And in this instance, unfortunately, it had eroded to such a point where the court was the only recourse remaining for the parties. But short of that, there certainly are resources that are available, and I suspect they're available in communities all throughout the county who are specifically set up for these types of situations. There's a saying that says good fences make good neighbors, but I think that, quite frankly, that we have really taken the unity out of community. And when we restore that, we can have communities, and we can have neighborhoods, and we can have entire, civilized societies where people actually look out for each other, and they care about what happens to each other, and they are concerned about what happens. We are our neighbor's keepers. Whether we want to or not, or whether we like it or not, it is really the reality of our circumstance. I have neighbors that if I see their garage door open too long, I'm gonna call and find out if you all are in town, or is everything okay? And to someone else, they might think that, hey, she's just being the nosy neighbor, and we need to put a fence in the front yard now so she can't look across the street. But in fact, it is just out of pure concern that these are human beings, and that something might happen to them, but for me inquiring. And it's okay to do that. I think we've gotten to a point in society where we are now too afraid, like you said, and we're too afraid to come to each other's rescue. We're too concerned about what the backlash might be, or what the thought might be, or that somebody is putting their nose where it doesn't belong. when we can do a whole lot of restoring of faith in each other by just showing random acts of kindness that build us back to the point where we restore unity into our communities.
That was my question, and I would like to just kind of.
Oh, sure.
I went to city hall mediation, and the person is now doing what they had promised not to do in mediation.
Really?
Yes.
And in instances, and I'm not suggesting that mediation is fail-safe, or that you will always get the perfect outcome or answer. As in the example that I gave earlier, I think that that's why it ultimately landed in front of me, because mediation was not an option that would be reasonably exercised by the parties. And so it took, another individual, myself, coming in and imposing something that was unique and different to stop and thwart the behavior. And for some people, that's what ultimately has to happen, is that behavior has to be stopped and changed.
I think sometimes you get a neighbor from hell and you can't change them at all.
They can buy a house for not a neighbor.
Yes.
How does a person, and I'm gonna ask Ed to answer this, how does a person respond civilly to something truly offensive? When someone makes an offensive statement?
I try to find a way to get that person to feel the same way I do, not by going back to the same type of comment or offensive suggestion, but just to say, how can you be in my shoes and accept that? And it's very, very situationally precise. So it's hard to say exactly how you would do it. I mentioned some of the situations I've been in before. We had a fellow who was working for the Afghan border police, and they were obviously letting people bring goods across the border without going through customs. And I chose to go over and talk to him about that. Unfortunately, he was standing in a contested zone between Iran and Afghanistan, so we had to diplomatically handle that, which meant that my escort, which were U.S. Marines and an Italian Carabinieri, I had to say, take all your weapons and leave them behind, because we have to go over and talk, along with our interpreter, this person. And he was doing something that was offensive to the other Afghans that I was with, not personally attacking them, but attacking what they were being trained to do. And we really just said to him, you're doing this and you're doing this to make a couple of dollars, but you are actually harming the country that you are all trying to form today for the future of not only yourselves, but your children. So we tried to build a little guilt into what he was doing. He didn't look like he was accepting the message, and it didn't take very long before we noticed he was the only one with his AK-47, so we didn't argue with him for a long time. But we tried to use guilt in that case. Say you're not doing the right thing, you're trained to be one of the border police, and you're not doing your job, you're hurting your country. And then I don't think it was successful, because I think some people are more difficult to change.
Judge, do you mind if I respond to that?
No, not at all.
I was sharing this on a phone call we had a couple of weeks ago. In situations that are really difficult like that, I had a professor in grad school who was a recovering lawyer, who, when it was in our intro to, or not intro, it was a mediation and negotiation class. I have a degree in conflict resolution. And we would bring these types of situations to class, and his response was always, sometimes, maybe, it depends. Sometimes, maybe, it depends. And what I learned in that class over the course of, 12, 14 weeks, is that it depends on your relationship. It depends on the power dynamics. You might be able to do something with one person that you can't do with another, vice versa. And maybe the context is right to speak up, but maybe it's not. So it's really situational, as Ed pointed out. And I think largely depends on the relationship. It depends on the power dynamics. It depends on whether or not you feel safe. And so, yeah, it's complex. And one of the things that I'll make a really quick, I wasn't planning on doing this, quick pitch for the program I work with at Tri-C is we teach the skills so that you have this toolbox of skills in conflict resolution, and hopefully over the course of a few classes and practice, and all three of you have experience working with people. You develop skills over time and through practice, right? And in those different situations that pop up, you're able to draw out the right skills and the right approach in that moment, and it depends on a lot of things. So that's my response.
Great. As civil activists, how do you suggest we respond or not to online misinformation, anger, disrespect, at city officials or for different city activities? Judge?
Sometimes, maybe, it depends. I frequently, and I think this is the experience many of us share, we see something on a social media platform and we just want to pull our hair out, and it can really engender a certain response. What I can tell you is that there's something cathartic about sitting down and just sort of typing out that flippant reaction that you have. But I also encourage you to do that and then walk away before you hit send. You got it out and let it sit there, but walk away, because some bells can't be unrung. Some things do need to be purged, but there's some things you can't take back. And to the extent that those are just our limitations, then again, we have reactions about everything. We've got feelings, emotions, opinions, and again, our responses should be tempered by sometimes, maybe, it depends. But go ahead and get it out, but just don't hit send. Put it in the draft box, let it sit there for a day or two. If you really have to, send it to a friend and have them look at it before you send it to where you really wanted it to go. You'll often get back a very candid piece of advice on just what to do with that cathartic release before it is now available for public consumption. Because again, there are some bells you can't unring.
I agree, I send everything to my wife first.
Well, my wife and I, if we see something controversial, we'll both say, swipe by. Just swipe by. Don't stop, just swipe by. And some people may need to actually engage in that activity to avoid some of the uncivil discourse that may result from your responses. How do you handle cases where one side will see the most likely outcome as a total repudiation of their values and hopes for the future? Yeah. Ty, I'm sorry, Ty. I should say situations, cases usually, they're.
I've consumed all the time tonight, I'm gonna pass on that one.
So I'll say, how do you handle situations where one side will see the most likely outcome as a total repudiation of their values and hopes for the future?
Yeah, that's really hard. Ed, do you want to speak?
Well, I would start by trying to explore what his hopes are for the future.
Yeah.
Find out what they are, and then try to see, are there any aspects of the solution that actually tie into that, or could support, or could evolve into that. I think it comes back to this thing of trying to find commonality. Where are you in sync rather than out of sync? But you have to understand what he's talking about. And if he talks about, it's not consistent with my values, say, all right, what values? Can you explain what your values are that you're talking about? Because values is very generic if you're talking about your relationship values, your monetary values. What are you talking about? So you need to drill down and understand what that is without talking in a condescending or a challenging way. Can you help us understand so maybe we come up with a solution that more fits your values?
And to build on that, I really really appreciate that response, Ed, and thanks for giving me some time. One of the ways that I frame conflict when I'm teaching or doing a workshop or talking is conflict occurs when our needs, interests, identities, or values are threatened or they're perceived to be threatened. And more often than not, it's perceived threat to our values. There's not real threat there. So like digging down, like Ed was saying, asking open-ended questions, really understanding, helps to sometimes break down that very narrow tunnel vision and create space for dialogue to occur. And then sometimes that can lead to productive conversation. That's my thought.
Okay, I'm going to ask each of you to provide a brief closing statement. I'm not going to put a time limit on it. Well, let me take that back, I will. Probably no longer than 5 minutes. Well, actually, we'll go 4 because that's the same amount of time that you have for your opening statement. And we'll start from the end with time, with Judge, and then Ed conclude.
Well, first of all, I just want to say thank you all for having us tonight, and thank you to the other panelists and the judge for facilitating this conversation. I think just even being here and listening to different perspectives is important. You all represent a variety of different perspectives, beliefs, interests, values, identities, and my hope is that this has provided at least one insight for each of you. I know it has for me, and I'm grateful for that. I think the final thing I want to end with is I think part of beyond, Judge expanded on some of the reasons behind why incivility occurs. I think there is growing incivility in society today because there is growing levels of fear. And I think fear breeds incivility, and maybe it's even just perceived fear. Like it's not. We shouldn't really be afraid. We aren't really threatened. I don't know. For some people, it is real. And so I think one of the things that we can do as individuals is begin to recognize when we are in conflict or when we're borderline being incivil, because I know I've been, is what needs, values, interests, identities of mine are being threatened in this moment, or do I perceive to be threatened in this moment? And just by taking that breath and reflecting on that for a moment can help to bring us down and not react, but instead respond, or even better, listen. So that's my closing thought.
I want to once again thank this wonderful community for having the foresight and the courage to have a very important conversation. My hope for you is that once we conclude today, that conversation continues in some way or another, either in large groups like this, or even in smaller groups around coffee tables, or at your homes, or in barbershops, or just at book clubs. Because what is indeed important to understand, and I think what we've heard resonate in parts throughout tonight's discussion, is that there is certainly a willingness to have conversations in settings like this, but our world is being saturated with computer screens and telephones and digital devices that sometimes individuals who are not as caring or compassionate or empathetic can hide behind. And we have to have the proper tools to, if we desire to properly respond to that. I do agree that we do have an erosion of a lot of things, empathy and civility being one of them. And my concern is that we're seeing it in all facets of our life and leadership. And because we look to these levels of leadership for guidance and for how we should track our own lives, when we don't have the best examples, then we lose hope. And inside of that loss of hope breeds fear. And inside of that fear comes reactions, frequently uncivilized reactions, because we aren't investing the time to get to know each other. We aren't actively listening so that we can genuinely hear someone's heart as well as what's coming from their mouth. And we are lacking the patience to understand exactly the vantage point that our friends and neighbors and sometimes even complete strangers are coming from. And because of that, we're raising the temperature, not just locally and in our own backyards, but we are doing it in every facet of the world, in every corner. You turn on your television and we're seeing this over and over again. And perhaps if we drill down, we could probably determine the few root cause issues for a lot of what we experience. But what you've done today is sparked a light in a community that says that we care to tackle one of society's greatest issues and challenges, because we believe we can make a difference. And I applaud you for doing that, because there aren't too many communities like yours who are so committed, and not just what today looks like, but what we deliver to our children tomorrow. Because indeed, what they inherit will be the seeds that we've planted. And we can't expect to reap a harvest of great flowers if all we're planting are thorns. And so thank you all so much for your attentiveness and your participation in this evening's important discussion, because it matters. For folks like me, I feel like I've developed a bit of a thick skin, because I've come to understand that individuals will present to me with varying issues and challenges, and I have an obligation to tune in differently and to not respond just reactively. You all have a choice when you deal with your neighbors or your friends or the random clerk at the grocery store. But I'm hopeful that when you leave here tonight, we've done something to equip you a little bit better. That when you begin to have that encounter, that you can now respond differently, because you'll see differently, you'll understand a little bit differently, and you'll begin to change your community one person at a time. Thank you.
What she said. I think you're running for office. Very good. I think it's been spectacular what we've heard tonight, and hopefully everyone can absorb it. We have to remember that each one of us is different. We see life different. We come from different backgrounds. When we talk, the words we're using are being used differently than what we're used to hearing. So when you talk, I encourage you to do it in a civil way. Use what we've talked about today. Go softly, explore what you're hearing, validate what you hear from someone else. Question to some extent, look for commonality. There's more in common than there is not in common. If you hear something you question, research it a little bit. And don't research it by going to one channel, particularly one channel that might be an opinion channel rather than a news channel. Read different sources, listen to different people, try to get different interpretations. Be wary of people that like to manipulate, because there's an awful lot of people that are very good spokespeople that like spokespersons that like to manipulate. So listen to everyone, listen carefully, try to understand what they're really saying. But be careful, because some people are trying to twist the message all the time. To be aware.
Thank you very much.
I want to personally thank Smith, Mr. Olson, of course, my friend, Judge who inspires, for coming out tonight, and not just for coming out, but providing an in-depth discussion about civil discourse and mutual respect. I believe that I've learned a lot, even though most people think that when you get the robe that you know everything, except for my wife. But, what we've been able to discuss is that we're all a community. This is a community, and we've got a responsibility to promote civility in our own personal conversations and educating our children and responding safely to situations where we see uncivil conduct or someone being attacked. I believe that based on what the council stated, that we are, and I'm repeating some of the phrases that they have mentioned today, but look for commonality, engage in communications that respects the identity of an individual and their culture. Be careful not to be offensive, and also listen and be respectful while you're listening. Remember your tone and demeanor in your conversations, and make sure that the impetus behind that is going to create a calming situation. Stay away from provocative terms that you know can incite an individual. Don't respond in kind to offensive statements, even though your natural inclination may be to react in kind. I like this one, and I've used this quite often. Stop. Stop. Take a breath. Observe and then proceed. Stop. Take a breath. Observe and then proceed. And if it's a dangerous situation, just run. Make sure that you're working to engage individuals. And the last thing, which I think is vital, is don't take it personally. And I say that quite often in the courtroom, and I really say it to the attorneys because it's a confrontational profession. No one wants to lose, so it's competitive as well. But at the end of the day, you should not take it personally. You're doing your job just as well in these situations where individuals have certain values, certain beliefs, and you can't influence them. You can't take it personally. And the last thing that I will mention is just reiterate some of the consequences that occur if you decide that you do want to engage in civil unrest or civil or uncivil discourse, is that you face the real probability of your liberty being taken away. You also face the risk of losing money. Your finances can be impacted as well because you can be sued for certain actions that you engage in. And there are only because of the fact that we live in the United States of America and we have a wonderful Constitution that some people think that we don't have or they need to adhere to. I won't mention any names, but because of that Constitution, it gives individuals the right to make certain statements, and they can be legally held accountable for those. But we have an obligation to make sure that we don't react in a way that causes us to be subject to some type of legal sanction. So you have to be mindful of that. I want to thank Lakewood Alive for this wonderful, wonderful event. It's my hope that this is a model for other communities, not just in Northeast Ohio, but throughout the state and then eventually throughout the country, because we need to have these very imperative conversations so that we can get back to civility and not have it deteriorate any further. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. This was just a really wonderful dialogue. I appreciate everything that you had to say tonight. Thank you for providing some really wonderful questions. There's a lot to think about. There's a lot happening in our world that is really challenging. And so I appreciate that we had some time to be able to talk about it this evening. If you would please, as a point of order, fill out your evaluation sheet. Let us know what you'd like to hear about. Let us know how we did tonight. We hold community forums in the spring and in the fall. There's another one coming up in November that we'll start planning in earnest in the next few weeks. So we'd love to get your feedback of something that you think is really important. So you can help to guide this conversation as we move forward. So once again, thank you very much for joining us tonight. Thank you so much to our wonderful panelists. Thank you to the judge. You did a great job.